In one of my previous Star Rail videos, I mentioned that I was getting very close to putting this game away for good. Not because I hated the game, but because I felt myself slowly disconnecting from what the story was doing. So when this new update dropped, I decided to give it one more honest chance. I wanted to spend time in the new region to see how it was framed, feel out the story, and figure out whatever Star Rail still had something new to say to me, or if I was just going through familiar motions again. I didn't get very far. Not because anything immediately went wrong, but because after a couple of hours I realized I already knew how this was going to feel. I could see the shape of the story forming, the rhythm it was settling into, and I recognized it. That's what this video is about. Not a full review of the update and not a breakdown of every new system or character, but the moment where a pattern becomes clear enough that continuing stops feeling meaningful. So let's talk about what I played, what stood out, and why this update ended up confirming something I've been circling for a while. One thing I want to give Star Rail full credit for is its world building, especially in terms of scale. If we're talking purely about size, variety, and ambition, Star Rail is probably one of the strongest gacha games in the genre. The universe it's building is massive, each region is visually distinct, conceptually rich, and packed with ideas. Every new world feels colorful, strange, and full of things to explore. On paper, that's a huge strength. And it can be a strength if you're able to tell a compelling story inside a universe that large. That's where Star Rail starts to struggle. The biggest issue for me is the region-to-region storytelling format. I've talked about this before, and it's not a format I'm particularly fond of in gacha games to begin with, but Star Rail really shows the limits of it, because every time you move to a new region, the story doesn't just shift focus, it resets. And I don't mean a light reset, like introducing a few new characters or a new local conflict. In Star Rail, it feels like almost everything gets wiped clean. New world, new rules, new factions, new history, new terminology, new emotional context. Each region is so large and so densely built that it demands the same level of explanation and setup that entire gacha games spend years establishing. That's impressive, but it comes at a cost. When every region needs that much world building, the story is forced to slow down. A lot. You spend hours just being introduced to how this place works, what happened here in the past, who matters, and why any of this should concern you. And the first few times that sense of discovery is genuinely fun. But when I started this new region, something felt different. It wasn't that the world building was bad. I was expecting the info dump, I was prepared for it, I went along with it. But the longer I played, the heavier it started to feel. More explanation, more setup, more lore, and very little story to anchor it. At some point it stopped feeling like discovery and started feeling like obligation. And that's when it really clicked for me. This isn't a one-time thing. This is the structure. Every new region means starting this process over again. Months of real-world time spent establishing another massive setting before the narrative can even begin to move. The problem isn't that Star Rail universe is too big. The problem is that so much creative energy goes into building these worlds that there's very little left to actually do something interesting with them, natively. If you can't tell a compelling story inside that scale, then the scale stops being a strength and starts becoming friction. No matter how beautiful or imaginative a world is, if the story inside it feels thin or delayed, the experience becomes exhausting instead of exciting. And that's where the next issue starts to show up, because when the world keeps resetting, the plot can't help but do the same. Once you accept that the world resets every region, it becomes hard not to notice that the plot does too. Star Rail's central idea is actually a strong one. At the beginning, it genuinely worked for me. The protagonist and their crew are moving along a path that's already been set, a journey shaped by forces far larger than them, by destinies that they didn't choose but can't escape. That's a compelling premise. The problem is that the story never really builds on it. Instead of developing that idea into something more complex over time, Star Rail keeps reusing it in almost the same form. Region after region, we arrive somewhere new, encounter a local crisis, brush up against the same sense of predetermined fate, deal with it, and move on. Then the cycle starts again. At first, that repetition feels thematic. It reinforces the idea that this journey is inevitable, that no matter where you go, you're still trapped within the same cosmic structure. But after a while, it stops feeling intentional and starts feeling stagnant. Several years into the game, the main plot is still asking the same questions it asked at the beginning, without offering new answers or perspective. The premise hasn't deepened, it's just been restarted. And it's not only the main plot that suffers from this, even the smaller narrative bits inside it begin to repeat themselves, sometimes almost bit for bit. The moment that really drove this home for me in this new update was when the protagonist and March found themselves trapped in an illusion again. Not a variation on that idea, not a twist on the concept, the same situation. They don't realize they're in an illusion, the illusion hides itself. The story revolves around slowly figuring out what's real and what isn't. It's a plotline Star Rail has already used multiple times, and at this point, it's hard to even remember how many. Once or twice this kind of scenario can be effective. It plays with perception, identity and uncertainty, but when you keep returning to it without meaningfully changing how it works, it stops being intriguing and starts feeling mechanical. You can tell the writers really like this idea, and I get why. It's flexible, it's dramatic, and it fits the game themes. But no matter how much you like a narrative device, you can't just keep copy-pasting it and expect to carry the same weight. Eventually the tension disappears. And worse, it starts to raise uncomfortable questions about the characters themselves. At this point in the story, the protagonist and their crew are experienced. They've been through this before, multiple times. So when they keep falling into the exact same situation again, it doesn't feel tragic or inevitable, it feels artificial. That's where the repetition stops being a plot problem and starts becoming a character problem. Because if the story keeps putting the cast in scenarios they should reasonably be able to recognize or resist by now, then their growth isn't being ignored, it's being overwritten. And that's what finally pushed me towards the next realization. This isn't just about world building or plot structure anymore, it's about what this kind of storytelling does to the people who are supposed to be at the center of it. Up until now I've talked a lot about structure, world building, region resets, and repeating plot bits. But honestly, even with all of that, Star Rail could have still worked for me. If the protagonist and their crew were written well, this could have been a great story. Because no matter how often the world resets, the main characters are supposed to be the constant. They're the through line. They're the ones who should be carrying the experience forward, learning from what they've been through and changing as the journey continues. That's where Star Rail loses me completely. I've seen people describing Star Rail as an anthology, and I understand why. Each region feels self-contained, each arc introduces its own cast, themes and conflicts, but I don't think that's actually what the game is trying to be. Star Rail is written like a sci-fi epic, a long continuous journey through the universe. And in that kind of story, the protagonist can't stay the same forever. They're supposed to accumulate experience, they're supposed to learn, they're supposed to change, but they don't. Instead, the protagonist and their crew reset along with the regions. They don't carry lessons forward, they don't meaningfully adapt, they don't become more perceptive, more cautious or more decisive based on what they've already survived. They're fundamentally the same characters they were at the beginning of the story, and that's a huge problem. If the cast were actually allowed to develop, even subtly, they could have anchored the narrative. Even with the world resetting every region, the characters themselves could have provided continuity and growth. They could have been the thing that made the journey feel cumulative, but the story doesn't let them do that. What finally broke this for me in this new update was how blatantly the character's agency gets ignored when the plot needs to move in a certain direction. There's a moment where the protagonist gets captured by a new character, and my immediate reaction wasn't shock, it was confusion. Not because the character is uninteresting, but because the situation doesn't make sense given who the protagonist is supposed to be by now. These are characters who have fought against cosmic forces, that caught the attention of aeons. They've survived situations that should, by all logic, put them far beyond helplessly being trapped by relatively grounded threats, and yet the story treats them as if none of that matters. The same thing happens with the illusion plotline. By this point, the protagonist and March have been through the scenarios like this multiple times. Even if they weren't overwhelmingly powerful, they should at least be aware, they should recognize the sign, they should adapt. Instead, they fall into the same trap again, not because it's tragic, but because the plot needs them to. That's when it stopped feeling like a story about characters on a journey and started feeling like characters being moved around to serve a pre-written outline. The protagonists aren't allowed to use the knowledge they've gained, they aren't allowed to leverage their power, they aren't even allowed to learn from repeated mistakes, because if they did, the writers wouldn't be able to keep telling the same kinds of stories in the same way. So their growth gets frozen, and once that happens, everything else starts to collapse. When characters don't change, repetition becomes unavoidable, stakes lose their weight, and situations that are meant to feel tense or mysterious just feels artificial. More than anything else is why this update finally pushed me away. Not because Star Rail lacks ideas, it clearly doesn't, but because the people at the center of the story are no longer allowed to matter in a way they should. By this point, it should probably be clear, but yes, I decided to stop playing Star Rail. By the time I started writing this script, I had already uninstalled the game. And if you're wondering whatever that felt refreshing or freeing, honestly, it didn't. It mostly felt sad. I've been playing Star Rail since day one. I put years into the story, time, attention, emotional investment. Walking away from something like that never feels good, especially when it's a story you wanted to love and once did. Abandoning a narrative halfway through always hurts, and this was no exception. But at some point it stopped giving anything back. The reason I care so much about writing and storytelling is because they keep me engaged, they make me think, they make me feel something. That's why I play gacha games in the first place, not for completion, not out of habit, but because I enjoy being invested in their narratives. And Star Rail just doesn't do that for me anymore. Playing it started to feel like a chore, not because the game is bad, but because the story no longer meets me where I am. It stopped surprising me, it stopped challenging itself, and I found myself continuing out of obligation rather than curiosity. That's not a healthy place to be with a story. So like any relationship that's run its course, I stepped away. This doesn't mean Star Rail is a bad game. I'm not telling anyone to quit. I completely understand why people still enjoy it. The worlds are imaginative, and if the things I talked about don't bother you, there's still plenty here to love. But for me, this isn't what I consider strong storytelling anymore, and it's not the kind of narrative I want to keep investing my time into. Because of that, this will probably be my last video on Star Rail, at least for the foreseeable future. There are new gacha games coming that genuinely interest me, and I want to spend more time on projects like Arknights Enfield and other upcoming titles that feel like they still have something new to say. So this isn't bitterness, it's closure. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking with me, especially on a more personal video like this. If you enjoyed thoughtful, narrative-focused discussions about gacha games, storytelling, and world building, consider liking the video and subscribing. And if you want to keep going, there's another video on the screen right now that might interest you. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.